Tell command we are running out of time." The voice crackled through the radio with a level of urgency that instantly silenced everyone inside the operations center. Maps covered the walls. Pilots stared at weather reports. Officers exchanged tense looks. Somewhere beyond the mountains, an entire platoon was waiting for help. The transmission ended in a burst of static. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then the story began 12 hours earlier. The sun had barely risen above the horizon when Captain Emily Carter stepped through the gates of Forward Operating Base Archer. The desert air was cool, carrying the distant sound of helicopters warming up on the flight line. Emily adjusted the strap of her gear bag and walked toward the aviation briefing building. At 5 feet 2 inches tall, she looked smaller than most of the pilots assigned to the base. She moved with quiet confidence, neither hurried nor slow, focused on the schedule ahead of her. A group of soldiers standing outside the building noticed her approach. One of them glanced toward another and smirked. "That is the new combat pilot." A few chuckles followed. Another soldier shook his head. "She looks like she belongs in an office, not a cockpit." Emily heard every word. She kept walking. Years of service had taught her that responding to comments rarely changed opinions. Performance did. Inside the briefing room, pilots filled the seats while maintenance crews delivered updates on aircraft readiness. Major Ryan Walker stood at the front reviewing mission assignments. A respected officer with years of operational experience, Ryan had earned a reputation for making sound decisions under pressure. As personnel settled into their chairs, his eyes briefly stopped on Emily. He reviewed her file again. Excellent evaluations. Outstanding flight records. Strong recommendations. Yet something about her appearance seemed to conflict with the image many people associated with combat aviation. Ryan immediately dismissed the thought, but the doubt remained somewhere in the back of his mind. The briefing continued. Weather forecasts were discussed. Flight routes were reviewed. Logistics missions and support. Operations were assigned. Emily listened carefully and took notes. She asked no unnecessary questions. She offered no speeches. When the meeting ended, several pilots gathered near the exit. One glanced toward Emily's flight helmet resting on the table. "You ever flown real combat support?" he asked. Emily looked at him. "Yes." "Where?" "Different places." The answer was calm and polite. The pilot laughed. "That sounds classified." Emily simply smiled and picked up her helmet. The conversation ended there. Outside, helicopters lined the runway under the growing morning sun. Ground crews moved between aircraft conducting inspections. Emily walked toward her assigned helicopter and began reviewing maintenance logs. Every detail mattered. Fuel levels, weather patterns, navigation updates. She worked methodically while others continued talking nearby. More than once she caught people glancing in her direction. More than once she heard quiet jokes about her size. None of it changed her routine. By mid-morning, the base had settled into its normal rhythm. Pilots prepared for scheduled operations. Officers reviewed reports. Soldiers loaded equipment. Everything appeared ordinary. No one knew that before the day ended, a single mission would test every assumption made that morning. No one knew that the pilot many people had dismissed with a smile would soon carry the responsibility for an entire platoon. And no one knew that somewhere beyond the distant mountains, a situation was already beginning to unfold that would change how this base remembered Captain Emily Carter forever. The morning passed without incident, but the opinions surrounding Captain Emily Carter did not change. If anything, they became more obvious. On the flight line, helicopters sat beneath the bright desert sun, while maintenance crews completed inspections and pilots prepared for scheduled operations. Emily moved from one checklist to another with quiet efficiency. She reviewed weather updates, examined navigation reports, and spoke briefly with technicians assigned to her aircraft. Every action reflected experience. Every question reflected preparation. Yet many people continued seeing only her. Size. Near the maintenance hangar, a group of pilots gathered around a utility vehicle discussing upcoming assignments. Emily walked past carrying a flight binder. One pilot lowered his voice, though not enough to avoid being heard. "I still do not understand why command puts people like her into combat aviation." Another shrugged. Maybe they were short on pilots. A few laughed. Emily continued walking without breaking stride. Inside the operations building, Major Ryan Walker reviewed mission schedules for the following day. Several platoons would be conducting exercises in mountainous terrain west of the base. Aviation support had been assigned as a precaution. Nothing appeared unusual. Still, Ryan found himself studying Emily's qualifications again. The records were impressive. More than impressive. Thousands of flight hours. Advanced certifications. Exceptional evaluations from previous commanders. On paper, she looked like one of the strongest pilots in the unit. Yet Ryan struggled to reconcile those credentials with the image people around him seemed determined to believe. Later that afternoon, a planning meeting brought pilots and officers together for a mission overview. Large digital maps displayed terrain features, weather patterns, and potential landing zones. Emily sat quietly near the end of the table taking notes. During the discussion, one officer highlighted a narrow mountain corridor known for unpredictable wind conditions. Several pilots exchanged concerned looks. Emily studied the map carefully. After a moment, she raised her hand. The eastern approach might offer a safer route during afternoon weather shifts. The room became quiet. Ryan looked toward her. Explain. Emily calmly outlined her reasoning. She referenced terrain contours, seasonal wind behavior, and previous flight data from the area. The explanation was concise and professional. For a brief moment, nobody responded. Then another pilot spoke. That route adds extra time. Several heads nodded. The discussion immediately shifted elsewhere. Emily wrote another note and remained silent. She did not argue. She did not defend her suggestion. She simply listened as the meeting continued. Ryan noticed something interesting. Nobody had actually challenged her analysis. They had simply dismissed it. The thought lingered in his mind long after the meeting ended. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the airfield. Helicopters continued arriving and departing. Soldiers loaded equipment for upcoming operations. The base remained busy and predictable, yet small signs suggested that conditions beyond the mountains were beginning to change. Weather reports showed increasing instability. Wind forecasts became less certain. Command updates grew more frequent. Most personnel ignored the information. Emily did not. Before leaving for the evening, she stopped by the operations desk and reviewed the latest reports one more time. Then she quietly returned the folder and headed toward her quarters. Behind her, aircraft crews continued joking, talking, and preparing for another routine day. None of them realized that within hours those weather reports would become critically important. None of them realized that the pilot whose advice had been ignored was already noticing details everyone else had missed. The following morning began before sunrise. The base slowly came to life beneath a dark blue sky as soldiers prepared equipment and aviation crews completed their pre-flight routines. Captain Emily Carter arrived at the flight line carrying her helmet and flight binder. The desert air felt colder than usual, and a steady wind moved across the runway from the western mountains. Emily noticed it immediately. She paused for a moment, looking toward the distant ridges barely visible against the horizon. Something about the weather pattern bothered her. Inside the operations center, mission briefings were already underway. Large digital displays showed routes, checkpoints, communication plans, and weather forecasts. Major Ryan Walker stood near the front of the room, reviewing final details with platoon leaders and pilots. Today's operation was considered routine. A platoon would move through mountainous terrain for a training mission while aviation assets remained available for support if necessary. Most personnel expected an uneventful day. Emily was not completely convinced. As the briefing continued, updated weather information appeared on one of the screens. Several officers glanced at it and moved on. Emily studied it carefully. The forecast showed increasing instability developing beyond the western ridges. The change looked minor to most people. To her, it looked significant. When Ryan opened the floor for questions, Emily raised her hand. "Sir, have we considered adjusting the support corridor farther east?" Ryan looked toward her. "Why?" Emily stood and pointed toward the weather display. "The pressure shift over the mountains is moving faster than predicted. If conditions continue developing, the western route may become difficult later this afternoon." A few officers examined the map. Before Ryan could respond, another pilot leaned back in his chair. "That forecast barely shows anything." Several people nodded. Another added, "We have flown that route dozens of times." Emily remained calm. "I understand. I am only recommending an alternate option if conditions worsen." The room fell silent for a moment. Ryan studied the display. Then he looked back at the group. Current route remains unchanged. Emily nodded. Yes, sir. She sat down without another word. The briefing moved forward. Yet Ryan found himself glancing at the weather data again. Something about Emily's confidence stood out. She had not sounded nervous. She had not sounded uncertain. She had spoken like someone who trusted her analysis completely. Hours later, the platoon departed according to schedule. Vehicles disappeared into the rugged terrain west of the base, while aviation crews remained on standby. The morning passed smoothly. Reports came in on time. Communications remained stable. Personnel across the base relaxed into their normal routines. Some of the pilots who had questioned Emily earlier seemed almost amused by her warning. Near the flight line, one smiled and said, "Looks like the mountains survived another day." A few others laughed. Emily simply continued reviewing weather updates inside the operations center. Shortly after noon, the first signs of change appeared. Wind speeds increased unexpectedly across several monitoring stations. Communication quality from the western sector began fluctuating. Ryan received the updates while reviewing logistics reports. His expression tightened slightly. Then another message arrived. Conditions in the mountains were deteriorating faster than expected. For the first time that day, Ryan looked across the room toward Emily. She was already studying the newest weather data, and from the look on her face, she had been expecting it. By early afternoon, the situation had changed from unusual to concerning. Inside the operations center, communication specialists monitored incoming reports while officers reviewed updated weather data appearing across multiple screens. The Western Mountain region was now experiencing conditions far different from what had been forecast that morning. Strong winds moved unpredictably through narrow valleys, reducing visibility and complicating movement across the terrain. Major Ryan Walker stood near the main operations table, studying the latest updates. Every report seemed slightly worse than the one before it. The platoon operating in the mountains remained in contact, but communication delays were becoming more frequent. What had started as a routine training operation was slowly turning into a logistical challenge. Across the room, Captain Emily Carter continued reviewing weather patterns and topographic maps. Several aviation personnel gathered around another workstation discussing possible support options. The confidence that had filled the room earlier in the day was beginning to fade. Ryan noticed it immediately. Experienced personnel rarely showed concern without reason. A communications specialist adjusted his headset and looked up. Signal quality is dropping again. Another update appeared on the main display. The platoon reported slower movement due to changing conditions and requested revised guidance. Ryan acknowledged the message and began evaluating alternatives. Emily stepped closer to the operations table. She studied the map for several seconds before speaking. The weather system is moving faster than expected. Ryan looked toward her. How much faster? Emily pointed toward several data points on the screen. At this rate, the western corridor could become difficult for both ground movement and air support before evening. A few officers exchanged uneasy looks. One of the pilots who had dismissed her concerns earlier crossed his arms and remained silent. For the first time all day, nobody laughed. Ryan focused on the information. The details matched what he was already seeing in the incoming reports. Still, changing operational plans required careful consideration. "What are you recommending?" he asked. Emily traced a route across the map. "If support becomes necessary later, we should begin evaluating eastern approach options now. They are longer, but conditions appear more stable." The room became quiet. Several officers examined the proposed route. It was not the most convenient option. It was not the fastest option, but it was logical. Ryan nodded slowly and instructed the team to begin reviewing contingency plans. Hours earlier, Emily's recommendations had been dismissed almost automatically. Now people were listening. Outside, the sky above the distant mountains continued changing. Dark clouds gathered along the ridgelines while gusting winds moved across the desert floor. Helicopter crews remained on standby near the flight line. Ground personnel secured equipment as forecasts continued updating. The atmosphere throughout the base felt different. More focused, more alert. Shortly before mid-afternoon, another transmission arrived from the platoon. The message remained professional, but the urgency was unmistakable. Conditions were deteriorating faster than anticipated. Progress had slowed significantly. Ryan read the report twice before setting it down. Then he looked across the room toward Emily. She was already studying the next weather update, as if she knew exactly what it would say. For the first time since she had arrived at the base, Ryan found himself relying on her assessment rather than questioning it. Beyond the mountains, the challenge was growing. Inside the operations center, the realization spread quietly from one person to another. If the situation continued developing at its current pace, someone would soon need to make a difficult decision. And the pilot many people had underestimated might be the one person most prepared for what was coming next. By late afternoon, concern had spread across every section of the base. What had begun as a weather complication was becoming something much more serious. Inside the operations center, communication screens displayed delayed updates from the platoon operating in the mountains. Signal quality continued weakening. Position reports arrived less frequently. Every new message seemed to carry additional challenges. Major Ryan Walker stood beside the main operations table reviewing information from multiple sources at once. Terrain maps, weather projections, and communication logs covered the displays around him. None of the data pointed toward an easy solution. The platoon remained organized and professional, but conditions around them were deteriorating faster than anyone had expected. Outside, the wind sweeping across the base had grown noticeably stronger. Dust moved across the runway in long waves. Helicopter crews remained on standby while maintenance teams secured equipment against the changing weather. The atmosphere no longer felt routine. Everyone sensed that important decisions were approaching. Captain Emily Carter continued studying reports from the Western Mountain region. She compared current conditions against historical weather data stored in the system. The pattern she feared was becoming increasingly obvious. Mountain passes that appeared manageable a few hours earlier were now becoming difficult to navigate. Visibility forecasts were dropping. Wind behavior was becoming unpredictable. Most concerning of all, the safe window for reaching the platoon was beginning to narrow. A communications specialist suddenly raised his hand. Incoming transmission. The room immediately became silent. The message appeared on the main display. The platoon commander reported that progress had slowed significantly due to worsening environmental conditions. Several planned routes were no longer viable. Supplies remained adequate for the moment, but movement options were shrinking. The report remained calm and professional. Yet everyone understood its significance. Time was becoming a factor. Ryan read the message carefully before looking around the room. Options. Several officers offered suggestions. Some recommended waiting for conditions to improve. Others proposed alternate support methods. Each idea seemed to create new complications. Emily listened quietly. Finally, she stepped closer to the operations table. If conditions continue following this pattern, waiting may reduce our choices rather than improve them. Ryan looked toward her. Explain. Emily pointed toward a series of weather indicators displayed on the screen. The eastern corridor remains relatively stable. If the storm system continues moving west to east, that corridor could become the safest approach available. But it may not stay open for long. The room grew quiet again. This time nobody dismissed her assessment. Several officers studied the data themselves and slowly nodded. The evidence supported her conclusion. Ryan folded his arms and looked at the map. The route Emily suggested was longer and more demanding, but it offered possibilities that other options did not. For several moments he said nothing. Then another update arrived from the platoon. Communication quality had weakened again. The message ended with a simple request for guidance. Ryan stared at the screen before turning toward Emily. Hours earlier, many people had questioned whether she belonged in combat aviation. Now some of those same people were waiting to hear what she thought should happen next. Outside the operations center, helicopters stood ready beneath the darkening sky. Inside, the growing realization settled over everyone present. The mission was entering a critical stage, and the pilot who had been underestimated from the moment she arrived might soon become the center of the entire operation. The operations center grew quieter as evening approached. The constant flow of updates continued, but the conversations had changed. Earlier in the day, people had debated possibilities. Now they were evaluating limited options. Every new weather report reduced flexibility. Every delayed transmission from the mountains increased urgency. Major Ryan Walker stood at the center of the room, studying a digital map illuminated by overhead monitors. Red and yellow weather indicators now covered large portions of the western region. The platoon remained organized and responsive, but the environment around them was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. Time was no longer working in their favor. Captain Emily Carter reviewed the same information from a nearby workstation. She compared current conditions against projected movement patterns and terrain restrictions. The answer becoming visible on her screen was not the answer anyone wanted. It was simply the answer supported by the data. After several minutes, she walked toward the operations table. The room gradually became silent. Even personnel who had once questioned her now listened when she spoke. Emily pointed toward a narrow section of terrain east of the platoon's location. This corridor is still open. Ryan followed her hand across the map. For how long? Emily glanced at the latest weather projection. Possibly a few hours. Possibly less. Several officers exchanged concerned looks. One asked, "Can aircraft get through there safely?" Emily studied the map again before answering. "It will not be easy, but it remains the most reliable route available." Nobody immediately responded. The corridor she identified passed through challenging terrain and required precise navigation. Yet every alternative looked worse. Ryan folded his arms and considered the options. He had spent years making difficult decisions. Experience taught him that waiting often felt safer than acting. Experience also taught him that waiting could become its own risk. Another transmission arrived from the platoon. Communication quality had weakened again. The message confirmed worsening conditions and requested updated guidance. Ryan listened carefully before turning toward Emily. "If we decide to move support assets, is that the route you would take?" Emily did not hesitate. "Yes, sir." "You are certain?" "As certain as the information allows." Her answer carried no arrogance. No attempt to impress anyone. Just confidence built on preparation and experience. The room remained quiet. Ryan looked around at the officers gathered near the table. Nobody offered a better alternative. For the first time since the situation began, the skepticism surrounding Emily had disappeared completely. People were not looking at her size anymore. They were looking at her judgment. Outside, helicopter crews received instructions to prepare aircraft for possible deployment. Ground personnel moved efficiently across the flight line as winds continued sweeping dust across the base. The sky beyond the mountains darkened further. Inside the operations center, tension slowly increased. Ryan finally made a decision. Begin preparations. The order immediately activated personnel throughout the room. Communication teams updated channels. Aviation crews reviewed flight plans. Logistics personnel coordinated support requirements. Amid the growing activity, Emily remained calm. She reviewed weather data one final time and made several notes inside her flight binder. Then she closed it. Ryan watched her for a moment. Earlier that morning, he had questioned whether she belonged in a combat aviation role. Now he found himself placing enormous trust in her assessment. The realization was impossible to ignore. Beyond the mountains, an entire platoon was depending on decisions being made inside that room. And the pilot many people had underestimated from the very beginning was about to become the person everyone depended on most. The flight line erupted into controlled activity as crews moved with purpose beneath the darkening sky. Helicopter engines began turning, their steady rhythm cutting through the growing wind. Captain Emily Carter walked across the tarmac, carrying her helmet beneath one arm and her flight binder beneath the other. Around her, technicians completed final inspections while aviation personnel reviewed the latest updates from the operations center. The atmosphere felt different from earlier in the day. The jokes were gone. The doubts were gone. Everyone understood the importance of what was about to happen. Emily climbed into the cockpit and carefully reviewed every system. Fuel status, navigation data, weather overlays, communication, channels. Her movements remained calm and precise. Nothing about her suggested urgency, even though the situation demanded it. Years of training had taught her that pressure only became dangerous when it affected judgment. Inside the operations center, Major Ryan Walker watched multiple displays showing weather movement across the mountains. Conditions continued changing, but the eastern corridor Emily had identified remained open. For now, a communications specialist looked toward Ryan. "The window is narrowing." Ryan nodded. He already knew. Every update confirmed the same reality. If support operations were delayed much longer, the available route might disappear entirely. On the flight line, Emily completed her final checks and contacted operations. Her voice came across the radio steady and professional. "Aircraft ready." Ryan heard the transmission and immediately felt a sense of confidence he had not expected. Earlier that morning, he had viewed Emily as an unknown variable. Now she felt like the strongest asset available. Clearance was approved. Moments later, the helicopter lifted from the runway and climbed into the evening sky. Emily guided the aircraft toward the mountains while monitoring weather conditions continuously. The terrain below gradually changed from open desert to steep ridges and narrow valleys. Winds pushed against the aircraft at irregular intervals, but Emily adjusted smoothly, making small corrections that kept the flight stable. Inside the operations center, personnel tracked her progress through position reports and navigation updates. Several officers gathered around the main display. Every few minutes another update appeared. Emily continued moving exactly where she had planned. One pilot who had questioned her earlier watched the screen silently. He no longer seemed interested in offering opinions. He simply followed the data. As the helicopter approached the eastern corridor, weather conditions became increasingly complex. Wind patterns shifted unexpectedly around terrain features. Visibility fluctuated. Emily remained focused, relying on experience, preparation, and constant observation. She remembered studying weather behavior in mountain environments years earlier. She remembered instructors emphasizing patience and discipline. Those lessons now guided every decision she made. Back at the base, another transmission arrived from the platoon. Communication quality remained inconsistent, but the message confirmed that conditions around them were continuing to deteriorate. Ryan immediately forwarded updated coordinates to Emily. Seconds later, her response arrived. Coordinates received. Nothing more. No complaints. No hesitation. Just acknowledgement and action. The simplicity of her response impressed everyone listening. Minutes passed. Then another position update appeared on the screen. Emily had successfully entered the corridor she recommended hours earlier. Several officers exchanged looks of surprise. The route was proving viable exactly as she had predicted. Ryan stared at the display for a long moment. Around him, people who once doubted Emily were now depending on her judgment. And somewhere beyond the mountains, the distance between her aircraft and the waiting platoon was growing smaller with every passing minute. The mountains emerged through the fading daylight as Captain Emily Carter continued following the narrow corridor she had identified hours earlier. The helicopter moved steadily between rugged ridgelines while changing winds tested every adjustment. Inside the cockpit, instruments glowed softly against the darkening sky. Emily monitored weather updates, terrain data, and communication signals without allowing any single distraction to break her concentration. Years of experience had taught her that difficult situations rarely required dramatic actions. They required disciplined decisions repeated over and over until the objective was reached. Back at Forward Operating Base Archer, the operations center remained focused on her progress. Major Ryan Walker stood beside the main display as position updates appeared across the screen. Each update confirmed what everyone was beginning to realize. Emily's assessment had been correct from the beginning. The route she recommended was holding. The timing she predicted was accurate. The opportunity she recognized. Before anyone else was now making a successful support operation possible. Around him, officers and pilots followed every transmission. Nobody was talking about her size anymore. Nobody was questioning whether she belonged in combat aviation. Those conversations felt very far away now. Several miles ahead, communication quality suddenly improved. A transmission from the platoon came through more clearly than before. Their commander reported worsening conditions around their location, but confirmed that personnel remained organized and ready to follow instructions. The message reached the operations center and Emily's aircraft almost simultaneously. Emily acknowledged the transmission and immediately began coordinating the next phase. Her voice remained calm and professional. Listening to her, it would have been impossible to know how much responsibility rested on her shoulders. Ryan listened carefully to every exchange. What impressed him most was not confidence. It was control. Emily never sounded rushed. She never sounded uncertain. She simply moved from one decision to the next as if she had prepared for this moment long before anyone else realized it was coming. As the helicopter approached the designated area, terrain conditions became increasingly complex. Visibility shifted from one valley to the next. Wind patterns changed without warning. Yet Emily continued making precise adjustments while maintaining constant communication. Every update reaching the operations center reflected progress. Every report reduced tension inside the room. Eventually, another transmission arrived. Contact had been established. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then a wave of relief moved through the operations center. The platoon was no longer isolated. The connection they needed had been made. Emily immediately began coordinating support and movement plans using the safest available routes identified through updated terrain and weather information. Her preparation earlier in the day now paid dividends. The notes she had taken, the forecasts she had studied, the warnings she had offered, all of it connected together. Major Walker watched the information flow across the screens and slowly shook his head. He remembered the first moment Emily had walked into the base. He remembered the quiet doubts people expressed. He remembered sharing some of those doubts himself. Now he stood surrounded by evidence, proving how wrong those assumptions had been. As evening settled across the mountains, the situation that once seemed headed toward crisis was steadily improving. The platoon had guidance. Support had arrived. Communication had been restored. And at the center of it all was the pilot many people had underestimated before they ever bothered to understand who she truly was. The helicopter returned to forward operating base Archer well after sunset. Lights along the runway cut through the darkness as ground crews moved into position. Inside the operations center, personnel watched the final updates arrive one after another. The platoon had received the support it needed. Communication had been restored. Safe movement plans had been coordinated successfully. What had once looked like a growing crisis had been transformed into an organized recovery effort through preparation, judgment, and timing. Major Ryan Walker remained standing near the main display long after the tension had faded from the room. Around him, officers began organizing reports and documenting the events of the day. Yet nobody seemed eager to leave. Everyone understood they had witnessed something important. Outside, the sound of rotor blades gradually slowed as the aircraft settled onto the runway. Captain Emily Carter completed her shutdown procedures with the same calm focus she had shown throughout the entire mission. When she finally stepped onto the tarmac carrying her helmet, there were no dramatic speeches waiting for her. No celebration, no spotlight, just a quiet line of personnel watching her walk across the flight line. Earlier that week, many of those same people had questioned whether she belonged there at all. Now they simply watched in respectful silence. Emily thanked the maintenance crew assigned to her aircraft and began gathering her equipment. To her, the mission was not about recognition. It was about doing the job correctly. Inside the operations center, Ryan reviewed the final summary reports. The details confirmed everything. Emily had identified the weather threat before anyone else. She had recognized the safest route. She had recommended contingency plans before conditions became critical. And when the moment arrived, she had executed the mission exactly as she predicted it could be done. The evidence left no room for doubt. Later that evening, Ryan stepped outside and crossed the flight line. He found Emily near the maintenance area completing paperwork beneath a row of overhead lights. She looked up as he approached. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ryan nodded. "You were right." Emily smiled slightly. "About the weather?" Ryan shook his head. "About all of it." The words carried more weight than a formal commendation. Emily thanked him and returned to her paperwork. The conversation was brief, but several nearby personnel overheard it. By the following morning, the atmosphere across the base felt completely different. Soldiers who had barely acknowledged Emily before now greeted her with genuine respect. Pilots who once joked about her size now discussed her judgment and professionalism. Some even asked questions about mountain flying and weather analysis. Emily answered politely, never mentioning the comments she had endured when she first arrived. She carried herself exactly the same way she had on the first day. The only thing that had changed was how others saw her. Later that afternoon, Ryan addressed a gathering of officers and aviation personnel. He spoke about preparation, leadership, and the danger of making assumptions. Without raising his voice, he reminded everyone that competence rarely announces itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it looks different than expected. And sometimes the person most capable of solving a problem is the one others overlook first. Across the crowd, Emily listened without seeking attention. She never needed recognition to know her value. As the meeting ended and people returned to their duties, one lesson remained behind. The pilot they believed was too small for the mission had carried the responsibility of an entire platoon when it mattered most. And in doing so, she had earned something far more meaningful than praise. She had earned respect.